All right, here we go, children. We're going to take some notes on sci-fi and dystopia. You can find the PDF on which you will take notes in today's learning folder. Or you can print it, or you can use multiple devices, any way that is easiest for you, or you're just going to probably be pausing this presentation and toggling between apps, Notability and this one. All right, so let's start with science fiction. What defines science fiction? So these are the typical characteristics of most science fiction. So science fiction is based on a scientific idea, even if it's really far-fetched. It's different from fantasy, which relies on things like magic. Science fiction always has kind of a scientific basis. Space exploration, medicine technology, the environment, etc. It's often set in the future or on another planet. Not always, but most of the time it's set in the future or on another planet. It seems plausible or believable as long as you willfully suspend your disbelief. Now, what does the willful suspension of disbelief mean? What that means is when we, as readers or viewers of TV shows and movies, willingly and with a glad heart give up any sense of what's realistic and not realistic for the sake of enjoying the story that we're either reading or watching. So you know something's unrealistic, but you're like, okay, I'm willing to kind of believe. Science fiction tends to make a critical comment on society or humankind, meaning a criticism, like take some aspect of society or humanity and shines sort of a bright spotlight on its flaws. It shows the impact of real or imagined science or technology on humanity. So a story, for example, about somebody who invents a time machine, and then we would see how time travel impacts society or humanity. And all science fiction explores the question, what if? Which is why science fiction is often referred to as speculative fiction, because it speculates what if, and I would honestly say that we should probably change the name of the genre to speculative fiction, make it official. So some sort of famous what ifs. What if most people were genetically engineered, which is the premise of a movie called Gattaca that we would have watched had we been together. What if the government watched our every move? The premise of the book 1984. What if people stopped reading books? That's the premise of a famous dystopian book called Fahrenheit 451. What if we could travel in time? The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. What if aliens invaded our planet? War of the Worlds. So we're going to talk now about dystopias, but in order to know what a dystopia is, we need to know what a utopia is. Dystopia is actually kind of an invented word that came from an actual word, utopia. So a utopia is an imaginary place that's perfect with respect to its social, political, and moral conditions. So it's a perfect place where everything is perfect all the time. So in other words, nowhere in real life does that exist. It's fictional. From the idea of a utopia came the idea of a dystopia, which is obviously the opposite of a utopia. A dystopia is an imagined society in which citizens live in fear and or are dehumanized. Now, we've talked about the word dehumanized a lot in reading class, but it means when you are treated as though you are less than human or unworthy of human dignity, unworthy of human rights, where your humanity is taken from you in some way or another. Dystopias, through exaggerated worst-case imagined scenarios, make a criticism about a current trend, a societal norm, or a political system. In a dystopian story, the setting drives the story and the character's decisions. Now, that's always true in all literature, but it's particularly true in certain genres, and dystopian fiction being one of those genres. So looking at the characteristics of dystopian societies and dystopian settings, citizens are dehumanized, which we just talked about. Citizens are manipulated with fear, with propaganda, with mind control. In other words, people's lives and minds are kind of not their own. Information, independent thought, and freedom are restricted, meaning usually these are the societies where governments exert an unreasonable amount of control over citizens and their lives. Citizens are or believe they are under constant surveillance, like somebody is always watching, so they need to be extra careful. And citizens are denied justice, meaning if they experience some kind of injustice, they have no recourse, no way to make things right because they live in a fundamentally unjust society. Dystopian settings or societies, citizens conform to enforced expectation, and individuality and dissent are discouraged. So again, it's the idea of somebody else kind of making the decisions about the way people should be and think and live, and people are not allowed to kind of exercise freedom or their rights to be unique individuals. Often, inequality is enforced or encouraged, or there's a manufactured or false sense of equality. Now, what I mean by that, I'm going to give you two examples, The Hunger Games and The Giver, assuming that even if you haven't read those books, you're probably familiar with the stories. So in The Hunger Games, inequality is enforced, meaning people who live in the capital are very wealthy and enjoy a lot of luxury, whereas people who live in the districts live in poverty and under the iron rule of the government. So that is a world in which inequality is enforced. Whereas in The Giver, everybody is equal, but it's a false sense of equality. It's something that's been sort of manufactured by the society to give everybody the impression of equality when in fact it's a pretty broken society. Continuing with those characteristics, a concept is often worshipped. So again, looking at The Giver, they worship the concept of equality to the point of it being problematic and dehumanizing. The society is sometimes, but not always, an illusion of a perfect world. So again, with The Giver, everybody thinks they're living in this perfect egalitarian world. And it's only until our protagonist starts to see through this, starts to see through and into the truth of the society that he begins to realize it's not perfect, but everyone who lives there thinks it is. Sometimes the setting is post-catastrophic or post-apocalyptic, meaning some major apocalypse or major catastrophe has happened before the story begins. And what we see is people trying to survive after these catastrophes or these apocalypses. An example of that would be all the zombie things that are so popular right now, right? It's the idea of trying to survive in this world where a virus has wiped out an enormous percentage of humanity. And people have to figure out how to survive post-catastrophe. Technology, science, medicine are often used to manipulate and or replace the natural order. So again, going back to The Giver, where birth and death are kind of managed by the society as opposed to the way they would happen naturally, as we all understand them to happen. So now we're going to talk about the protagonist, the dystopian protagonist, who is our main character in these dystopian stories, and they often have many of the following characteristics. They often feel like they're trapped and struggling to escape. That can be a literal trap and escape, like in Maze Runner, for example, or a more figurative like a sense that they can't be themselves because they are constrained by the rules of their society. That's a little bit more figurative. Our protagonist often questions the existing social and political systems, kind of looking at things and looking at them more closely and kind of asking, is this really how things should be? Our dystopian protagonist tends to believe or feel that something is terribly wrong with the society in which he or she lives, or They begin by being a believer in or obedient to the society, only to become rebellious as the story continues. So looking again at the Hunger Games and The Giver. In The Giver, everybody kind of believes that they live in this great society, including our protagonist, Jonah. And it's not until he learns more and more that he starts to see through it and become rebellious toward the end of the story, rebels against the rules of his society. Whereas the protagonist of Hunger Games, Katniss Everdeen, always knows that something is terribly wrong with her society. And she begins by always being rebellious, but she becomes increasingly rebellious as the trilogy continues. So now let's talk briefly about annotations. The good news is, I know you guys hate annotating, but the good news is our annotations will follow the same set of rules for all of the stories that we're going to read during this unit. So we'll read a number of science fiction, mostly dystopian, but maybe I'll throw some classic sci-fi in there as well. But we will annotate always for the purpose and the prompt, right? The two Ps. The purpose is always the same, to understand what we read. And our prompt is actually an essential question. It'll be the same for every single story, which is, what is the author trying to reveal about our own world in creating this dystopia? So what flaw of society or humanity is this author trying to illuminate by creating this exaggerated worst case scenario setting in society? And of course, we'll annotate for the characteristics of dystopian settings and societies and the characteristics of dystopian protagonists. And I want you to, when you read a passage that highlights a particular characteristic, you would actually note the specific characteristics. So if a person's, independent thought is being restricted, you read a passage and that's what you think, that's what you would write in the margin, independent thought, or some shorthand, some quick, brief way of noting which characteristic you were thinking of when you encountered that section of text. So this unit will take us either to the end of the school year or at least until we're back at school. It's a unit we always do. We're modifying it, to be more e-learning friendly. So keep an eye out for other learning opportunities as we travel on this dystopian journey together. We're kind of living right now in a weird dystopian world where we are not totally free to move about the way we normally would, right, with the coronavirus catastrophe. Although I think actually what we're doing is preventing a catastrophe. So it's probably a good idea. All right, I miss you all, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Later, skaters.